Welcome to Surviving Society.
Welcome to the first episode of The Poetics of Revolution. I speak with Professor AnaLouise Keating about Gloria Anzaldua. AnaLouise is Professor of Multicultural Women's and Gender Studies at Texas Women's University in Denton. She has written extensively on pedagogy, gender studies, and indigenous thought. Alongside Gloria Anzaldua, she edited This Bridge We Call Home: Radical Visions for Transformation, and has also published a set of detailed interviews with Anzaldua, as well as the decisive monograph on Anzalduan thought entitled The Gloria Anzaldua Reader. I'm really delighted and honoured to have AnaLouise Keating to speak with us today about Gloria Anzaldua. Thank you so much. So, Professor Keating, could you begin with telling us a bit about your engagement with Gloria Anzaldua as an intellectual, as a friend, and as a comrade, please?
So I first encountered Anzaldua's work via This Bridge Called My Back. And I read that near the end of my graduate studies. Her voice, her perspective, especially in La Prieta and El Mundo Zurdo, really spoke to me. She seemed to be doing something different from what much of what I had read was doing, but also something that, I saw like this kind of spiritual component that to me seemed to be driving her politics. After I got my doctoral degree, I was kind of over my topic for a while. So I picked up this new research topic, which was Anzaldua and Paula Gunn Allen and Audre Lorde, because all three of them seemed to do a kind of coalition building that had as part of its foundation some kind of spirit. Like they had this like large metaphysics. And so I was intent on writing about that and bringing that forward, because in my experience and what I had read, like that was being ignored. Scholars and were focusing on their feminism, on the outward stuff, which is all important, but it wasn't everything. So then my first job, I had the opportunity to go to University of Arizona and spend a week there. I was sponsored by the Southwest Institute for Research on Women at University of Arizona. And they were bringing Anzaldua in for a week, and they were bringing in 3 regional scholars. And so I was selected as one of the scholars. I wrote to her, and I sent her what I was working on and said, I would love to interview you, because I've read interviews with you. I've read all your work. I think there's this spirit component that's very political. I don't see anyone talking about it. I'd love to interview you. So I did interview her, and through all sorts of serendipitous things, I reached out and offered to edit a collection of her interviews. So we started working together. Well, we worked together on the interview because there was a lot of back and forth. She loved to share her work and get feedback, and I am just obsessive in my own desire to write and to write as well as possible. So we developed a friendship pretty quickly on because we had these very compatible interests. Yeah, my initial attraction to Anzaldua was that amazingly inclusive vision that's not anything goes, right? And just really trying to understand her politics of spirit. And then our friendship just kind of grew, and after the interview book, we started working on This Bridge We Call Home, so it just turned into a friendship and a working relationship, and she would read my work, I would read hers, I would give her feedback, and then she passed away unexpectedly, but I have been honored to be the steward for her unpublished writings and just for her literary reputation, we could say.
Thank you, yeah. That's great. Yeah, I've actually come across some of your work in her archives at the University of Texas in Austin, and that was really interesting. And you actually introduced me to her spirituality, if you like, or her concept of spiritual activism in your writing. And it is something, I must say, quite honestly, that a lot of us on the left, I'm talking about myself, haven't really fully grappled with. We kind of separate the realm of activism, perhaps, from that of spirituality. And so I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit more about what Anzaldua actually meant by spiritual activism in practice and how that's manifested, or how we can manifest that perhaps as movement builders or people in movement.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. My own struggle in bringing forward any words that had to do with spirit in feminist publications, it was very challenging. And honestly, I basically had to do a deep dive into post-structuralist thought and bring it in via post-structuralism to help get it more, acknowledged. And Anzaldua, she didn't really use the word much until I interviewed her in 98 when she was I was asking about the politics of spirit, and she called it spiritual activism. And I said, that's it. That's what we need, right? Because activism is the noun. Spiritual just modifies it. So action is always part of it, right? And if we can think of it like that, we avoid what's called spiritual bypassing, which people just, love and light. It's all love and light. Like, I'm going to meditate about this. I'm going to prayers and concerns. That bracketing off, that's the problem. And we see some activists do it. We certainly see it in a lot of political rhetoric. We see it all over the place. Anzaldua always connected anything to do with spirit with concrete action. Even if it wasn't a super easy A to B kind of line, it was always there. And just like since her passing, like looking at all her unpublished work and seeing how early she was working on it, like in the late 70s, she was developing this theory. And she herself, she studied multiple traditions, everything from Mesoamerican and curanderismo to Western occult and magic. Like, because she brought it all in as she was seeking technologies that we could use to make concrete change in social structures. It was always connected for her, and I think it always has to be. So I think that's part of the reason that academics have feared it and that activists have feared it is the bypassing. I think another thing that goes on is our Western epistemologies and our ontology is very materialistic, very physical based. And Anzaldua's metaphysics, which is what her activism grew out of, has its origins was deeply influenced by her own paranormal experiences. Whether it was this experience as a child when she was able to somehow either extend her arm and get this fruit she wanted, or she psychically drew the fruit to her, maybe some experiences of bilocation where you're in two places at the same time. There were she had experiences and she heard many stories about embodied human beings who were doing things that seemed to defy what material reality could say we could do. So she ended up with this very non-Western, non-linear understanding of time and space. And those are built into her spiritual activism in ways that are like invitations to us that it seems like we should be on the precipice of figuring out how to use. So maybe her metaphysics is like multiple interlocking dimensions. I don't know. I'm still thinking about all of that.
You're right. Reading her back, you can see the kind of idea of psychic thresholds, for instance, even in La Frontera borderlands. And yeah, I was wondering if you talk a little bit more about that. So Anzaldua does remain still the thinker of borderlands and thresholds, and her own grappling with the many borders of nation, of gender, of class, of sexuality, of race, etc., has profoundly shaped how we think about bordering as both process and method. How do you think Anzaldua would speak to the current moment especially, and those on the margins of empire or the fringes of the state at a time of increased border violence?
I look back to her thinking when in September 11, 2001, with the bombings in New York City and elsewhere, and I look at that essay she wrote, which is chapter 1 in Light in the Dark. Mm-hmm. And we see her grappling with it and acknowledging all the pain, and just like it makes no sense, and also trying to avoid a kind of us versus them approach to a solution. So I think that if she was here now, she would kind of lean into that contradiction. I think this is a particularly heartbreaking moment, right? It makes no sense. Like, it makes no sense to see people who are just acting so cruelly, and states and nations acting so cruelly in ways where we're not seeing their consequence, except as it's impacting the least powerful. And I don't know what Anzaldua would say to that, because anything that one could say involves taking a long view that I can think of, and then how do you take that larger, more complex view, but still hold and acknowledge all the pain and just the ridiculousness of the present moment?
I was also actually reading that first chapter, and I was amazed at how strong she was in her denunciation of the attacks of 2003 of Iraq in particular, but also Afghanistan, and her critique of George Bush. And it was very, very... It lacked some of the sort of lyrical tones and tenors of our earlier writing because it was vitriol and I could sense the anger and it did really speak to me. Anzaldua's project, and it's so inspiring, is because it's one of bridge building and hope even in conditions of absolute despair. But in this present moment when we're witnessing a full-blown genocide, how does one transgress or survive and even come to some sort of reconciliation? Is there a limit to her or in general to our aspirations of universalism, allyship, coalitional politics, whatever we want to call it? Or do you think we still keep trying for that?
So I don't think there's no blanket answer, right? For this, I look back to, I think about right before This Bridge We Call Home came out, like it was, it's kind of a reflection on This Bridge Called My Back, but it's even more radically inclusive. And in the course of putting the book together, like I was like working with so many amazing people, I said to Gloria, let's start a listserv. So I started a listserv for the contributors. And somehow in the process of the listserv, like this conversation started to erupt. And it went from some anger over the fact that there were white people in the book to this like really incredibly painful debate between Arab and Jewish feminists. And it was so, I'm an empath, as is Anzaldua. And it was, as I was just reading it and trying to summarize some of it to her, like I was getting physically sick, as was she. So she said, shut it down. Just shut it down. Like because there were some people who were trying to do this work of nepant latas and kind of like try to, let's look at this side and this side and there's things here, but it was taking this toll on our bodies. And she was and I was like, are you sure? Like that doesn't sound very, it's like, yes, at this point it's, you can't. So I think part of it, and this is not an answer or a way to address it, is we can't do everything and we can't necessarily do what we envision. And sometimes the process to get closer to what we envision in a particular circumstance could be so detrimental to one's own physicality that at the very least we have to draw back to whatever amount we have to draw back. And again, that's not an answer, but I think maybe there's some information there that might, I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I guess there's limits, and sometimes solidarity is needed, and sometimes you can't have solidarity with certain people, and I think to recognize your own limits is a useful kind of way to orient yourselves at times.
Especially if it can, if it's, she has that essay, bridge, drawbridge, island, sandbar. And she's talking about, and it kind of goes along with Sheila Sandoval's theory of differential consciousness. It's that idea that sometimes one withdraws, sometimes one does this, sometimes one does that. And so it's also, I think maybe also important to keep in mind is like, there's all these moments. And so as we make decision for specific moments, yes, we think of consequences. Yes, we think long term, but we also don't lock ourselves into whatever that moment is demanding of us, right? And then I think here, and again, I'm just, kind of thinking out loud, this is where a kind of spiritual activism, part of spiritual activism is this inward kind of epistemology where there's this inward reflection, but as you're reflecting inward, you're not just like, what do I really think? But you're tapping into these larger kind of cosmic sources of knowledge. That maybe there's other insights, like maybe there's ways to get other insights that we haven't thought of yet. Like this is a problem. We just keep doing the same thing over and over in the West, right? I mean, like, if we've been educated in the West and here we are talking English, we keep doing the same things. How do we get outside that? Like, how do we get to something genuinely different and try something different? Like, how do we even get our thinking there? Again, these are not solutions or even answers. They're just me kind of trying to think about it.
No, thank you. And yeah, her resistance to just speaking in English or writing in English is also really productive. So you mentioned the concept of Nepantla, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that and how that helps us, again, make sense of the world and what Anzaldua really meant.
Yeah, I don't know if it can help us make sense of the world. But so Anzaldua is, of course, still best known for her discussions of the borderlands, right? And of course, Borderlands, La Frontera de Nu Mestiza is the book that she is most known for. And she is talking in some ways about the border between the United States, specifically Texas, and Mexico. and how this nationalism builds up and how people are kind of like slotted in based on like where they happen to be, where the powers came down. And so she's talking about her experiences growing up on that border. And if you like Google a map of Hargill, Texas, you'll see how incredibly close it is to Mexico. It's so close. And even as we think about those geographic borders, it's really instructive for us to remember, and we can do this when we look at the archives. Some of it she wrote when she was thinking about California and was in California, that part. Some of it, like really important parts, she wrote when she was in, I think it's Connecticut, when she was on the north. Yeah, yes. And if you look at early versions of, in fact, if you look at editing of the book, you can see narrowing into that focus on South Texas. But the ideas were much larger. One of the most cruel poems in it that's really critiquing that kind of imperialism you see among Anglos, she wrote when she lived a year in Indiana, the state of Indiana, which is, it's more north than Texas. So even there, as she's talking about a geographic area, she's pulling in all these other geographic areas, as well as all her own experiences of being different and outside, which were everything from her early physiological differences due to health, to language, et cetera, and so on. So she talked about borderland like that, but even back then, if you look at the preface to Borderlands La Frontera, she's also talking about the other more liminal spaces, right? And I can't remember the list of adjectives she uses, but she's talking about lots of different borders. And so always those two meanings are there. But there became debates in the scholarship and among scholars, with some people saying, no, it's only the geographic border, right? It's only the borderland. That's, it's literal. And then there became some policing. Well, you can't talk about it like that. You're appropriating if you're talking about it like that, even though all the meanings were there in the first place. So Anzaldua, and this is a kind of typical strategy she did, was like, okay, I'm going to use another word. I'm going to talk about Nepantla now. So she could use Nepantla to talk about all those complex meanings of borderlands, but it could be more clear. Of course, Nepantla itself is that kind of liminality, right? And I think here, as she developed Nepantla, not only was she pulling on her own experiences of outsiderness and all her observations of it, but also she was influenced by, she did doctoral work at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She read Homi Bhabha and others. So she was also influenced in that idea of liminality, right? And if you think, and also some of the anthropological work, if you think of the limen as that threshold, you're not in, you're not out. You're at this point of transformation. You have no idea if you're going to be transformed. You could be killed, right? That's how rituals work. Nepantla can contain all of that, as well as honoring this kind of Mexica, this like a kind of Mexican mixed indigenous kind of thought and philosophy. So I think all of that is kind of going into her theory of Nepantla.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that is the sort of the focus on hybridity, on mestiza, on liminality, and she calls herself a Neplantera. All of that is a rejection of a composite mixed identity, but these kinds of different identities that shape herself and the way she sees the world. She has got some pushback on that along the lines of, that kind of sometimes elides questions of indigeneity, for instance. It almost celebrates this diversity in a way that flattens out indigenous experience. What would you say about that critique?
I think it's useful to always historicize things, right? So we, and I mean scholars in general, have learned a lot more about indigeneity since 2001 or 2002. When did she die? Her death, 2004, sorry. Yeah. We've learned a lot more about indigeneity. So do we take everything we know now or understand now and then go back and apply it and criticize her for that? We can certainly look at limitations, but what I've seen in some of the scholarship, and this will get me in trouble. This is how the academy works, by elevating yourself. It's very individualistic. What's a great way to elevate yourself? You see who's got the biggest reputation, you see who's got a lot of whatever, and you show their limitation. You say what they did wrong, and then look, now you're speaking, and you're speaking for these other people, or, whatever. And I think to some, just like this bridge called my back, is she still being the back for these other scholars in some ways, right? And this is not to say she was perfect, because she wasn't. Look at like Borderlands, and she talks about the Indian woman.
Mm-hmm.
That's very monolithic. But is she doing that at the end of her life? No. She's still growing and changing, right? So I think that, yeah, she's limited. And yeah, her work can be misappropriated. It can be used in lots of ways. And that's always a risk with us when we put our writing out into the world. It can be distorted and twisted and used in partial ways. Do we not do it because of that? I think we just do our best. And so, and I think, of course, any for Chicanas, for Mexican Americans, that historical mix is like, how do you sort it out? The history, the ancestry, unless you get your blood work done, and then really, like, what is that telling you, right? It's so complex. Would she, if she was around now, would she be acknowledging more of that complexity and trying to understand it more deeply? Probably. I don't see her anywhere stopping, even at the end, except when she, at the very end, when I think she was pretty depressed and things. There's certainly a slowdown with her health, but we don't see her mind stopping or, oh, now I know, right? I don't, like, she wasn't, both knowing her as a person and knowing her scholarship, she wasn't the kind of person who was like, my way's better. It would be more like, okay, I'm going to keep working on it this way. Okay, I still will do my work, and you don't take it, leave it.
Yeah, I think that's what makes her so special. Not just that she evolves, but also that she kind of rejects the academy, or she's in the academy but never off the academy. And that brings so much more richness and texture and life to her writings. And I was wondering if you had anything to say to some of us who are all sort of in the academy, to how not to just become of the academy. Are there any lessons? I know that's kind of a prescriptive word, but that we could draw on.
I think she models a kind of intellectual humility, which we can use, right? I think if we in the academy can remain grounded and centered in, like, what are my values? Like, what are my goals? And then we can ask ourselves, well, is my goal really to have 25 publications? Is my goal really whatever? Or is it to be bringing forth this perception and this understanding? And if we can, like, have this kind of trust in that, I think that, and at the same time, like, really be grateful for what an academic job gives us. It gives us a kind of tenuous job security. It gives us the ability to be talking about ideas and to be, kind of like nurturing people. Like, when Gloria was alive, like, honestly, and this is really embarrassing to me now because I know so much more about her since she passed, I would get really jealous because she could wake up when she wanted, she could write when she wanted, she could just work on her writing. Whereas, if you're an academic, you have service, you have lots and lots of grading, and I've never been in an elite school. My whole career has been at schools that are teaching intensive, typically public, so not great salaries, not release time, not sabbaticals. I haven't had any of that, and I feel really sorry for myself, right? But I had health insurance. Gloria didn't have access to a library. Like, I had to give her access via my information so she could get articles, or I had to get articles for her. Like, so I think even as I think intellectual humility, maintaining our sense of values, and just understanding that game. If that game of, like, be the best, get the most, apply for and so I personally pretty much have, like, stopped applying for funding, stopped applying to get awards, because, like, what I do is not valued in that kind of way. You only want to be, like, rejected for that, like, X amount of times. Then it's like, okay, like, the humanities likes books, the sciences and social sciences seem to prefer articles in certain kind of hierarchical journals. That's not where I want to publish. So I'm not going to keep trying to be evaluated by my peers who don't value what I do. So there's also kind of like, and I think her carving her own path is always instructive, because she had her goals in mind. She knew what she wanted. She wanted to be read. She wanted to write. She wanted to make an impact, and she followed it. I know that sounds really idealistic. I'm romanticizing, but also she really had a hard life, and she still did it, right?
Yeah, no, and she certainly did make that impact. and is read and is revered, I would say. So she achieved that in spite of all the challenges she faced, and there were so many of them. And she also told us about them, which is also really refreshing and poignant and honest. Given just how big an impact she's had and how capacious a thinker she's been, what would you say is her most lasting legacy, or what do you see in her as her greatest contribution to us as thinkers, to us as activists, to humanity, I would say? What would you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like first of all, your question is like a diamond, and depending on what side we're looking at, it's going to like have the highest flash for us. So I think that she's interesting and complex enough that different things are going to be the most salient for different of us, right? I am still most blown away by her spiritual activism, because it relies on this really deep, profound, non-Western, I'm going to say pretty much non-Western metaphysics that flies in the face of our hyper-individualism, right? If you're positing that everything is interrelated, even if you don't understand it, then you can't keep living out this kind of this self-enclosed hyper-individualism that certainly we see in the United States, like just pushed to the edge at this point. So there's all these implications like that. I think that going along with that, she has this ontology of this kind of like multidimensionality that I predict. I mean, look, there's the whole ontological turn in anthropology. There's like some really interesting and important stuff going on with UFOs. And, you know, I mean, like, not as aliens from outer space, but rather as this reminder that maybe this reality, this three-dimensional reality, is not the only one. There's these other dimensions. And I still am like living with the question of if that's the case, whether or not you can prove it, if we think about this kind of multidimensionality, then what can that mean for our social justice politics? Like, that's my question. So I'm kind of like, and I think she makes possible these kinds of questions. And not just makes possible, but I think she's accepted enough that she provides platforms so we can go farther. And her finally, after all these years, we're bringing out her book of it's like a novela cuentos. It's like both a novel and stories. La Prieta is Dreaming. Prieta is Dreaming will be out in November, and it's 19 short stories, interlocking short stories with her character Prieta, and some of them are. It's going to open more avenues for our thought. So I guess like her willingness to take all sorts of risks in terms of her thinking, in terms of what she said about her own life, in terms of how she lived her life, and leave that as a record for us, gives us all sorts of invitations and doors to open and follow. And they're never just about, look, I'm great, here's my life. They're always about the collective. And like that ability to balance both in this interrelated way, that's another like angle of the diamond that's super important.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, to end on the collective, I think is a good moment. But I'm really excited to read this new text. Do you know who it's being published with, or when?
Yeah, SUNY.
Okay, great.
Same as who put out this bridge, the same as who republished This Bridge Call My Back.
Okay, so we'll all get our copies in November. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you for listening. This episode has been brought to you by Surviving Society Productions. To support our work, like, review and subscribe. Follow us on Instagram, Blue Sky and Patreon.